I think I was 16, the first time I truly felt the weight of complete emptiness. That uncanny sensation where something is both present and absent at once. See, growing up, I was always one of those kids who stayed back at school long after most left. I was that weirdo who liked doing homework, and I would many days finish it in the silence of a school with its empty corridors and quiet rooms. But on that day, something happened. Time got away from me. Before I realized so, I had missed the last bus home, and there I was, left alone in a school that had shed its usual bustling nature, replaced instead with a vast, dreadful silence. A silence that wasn't peaceful, it was empty, and that emptiness brought with it a strange kind of fear. There are some places in the world that are never meant to be empty, places where people are an immeasurable yet important part of the equation. An empty mall can freak us out because it feels like something out of a horror flick, like something that has its soul ripped out and has become inherently unnatural. The bright colors and pretty lights now seem out of place and jarring. And the final closing piece is the silence. Emptiness has its own brand of quiet, a quiet that feels like a heavy blanket on your shoulders. A similar thing happens at an empty playground. The swings creak softly in the wind, swaying back and forth as if ridden by the ghost of the children who came before. It feels alien, and there is a reason why foggy, quiet, empty ghost towns seem so scary even when there is nothing obviously supernatural about them. So all I ask is, why? Why do empty places feel so strange? Before we continue, if you are enjoying what you see so far, please consider subscribing. Thank you. A dense forest teeming with things with far too sharp teeth is empty of human life. A deep, dark cave triggering claustrophobia in every man in a 10-mile radius is empty of human life. An abandoned mall, perfect for those grainy shaky cam documentaries, is empty of human life. These empty spaces, whether filled with threats unseen or just an eerie quiet, tap into our evolutionary instinct for survival. An empty space is often the absence of safety, a void where danger can lurk unseen, and the discomfort we feel is a survival mechanism hardwired into our DNA. Behind every action and reaction, behind every reasoning and logic is one simple goal, and that's to survive. You may have a death wish and the survival instincts of an average house cat, but your body knows. I suppose this is what we call instinct, an unidentifiable and impossible to measure sense which becomes the final line of defense. But the complete absence of people somewhere is often a very clear indicator that said place is not safe. If no one is there, it's for a reason, a danger they sensed or a risk they avoided. This primal knowledge runs deeper than conscious thought. We instinctively know that emptiness isn't a neutral state. It's a signal that something is wrong, that something out there hidden from our view is best avoided. And this helps us understand why we fear ghost towns. Because what's more scary than a place that used to be a place of life, but is now just something abandoned and discarded? So the first reason in a long list of reasons why we dislike emptiness is due to evolution. It's this idea that our ancestors learned to thrive by avoiding the voids where unseen threats could hide. And as we navigate our modern world, that instinct persists, guiding us through the unsettling silence of empty parking lots and swimming pools, and reminding us that in every absence there may lie a story. According to Wikipedia, The uncanny valley is a psychological and aesthetic relation between an object's degree of resemblance to a human being and our emotional response to said object. So what does that mean exactly? Well, quite simply put, the uncanny valley is the relation between something that looks and seems human and how we respond to it. In most cases, the uncanny valley is used to explain why that doll looks creepy, why that particular $1 billion CGI puppet looks off, and why circus clowns freak us out. But I think this effect can go beyond. Tell me something. Do you know how your room is? I would guess yes. So if one day you wake up to it being slightly different, how would you react? Let's say tomorrow you sit up in bed and find that your walls are the incorrect shade of lilac, or that particular lamp sitting on your desk is smaller than it should be. Nothing is obviously out of place, but still something's wrong. This subtle change can create a dissonance that triggers a sense of unease. We can stretch this idea to a place as well, because when it comes to public places like a playground or a shopping mall, we all have sort of a mental map already. And this map includes not just the tangible locations, but also the intangible nature of the place. A completely empty shopping mall feels creepy for the same reason a food court filled with people who aren't eating but instead silently chanting would feel strange. It's just not meant to be like that. We think that it's the lack of one sense that makes another more. Like how the blind can sometimes hear things most others do not. But I think that the lack of one sense can also heighten itself. Of course, this won't work on the sightless that simply cannot see. But do you notice how the inability to see in the dark helps us see more, and how it sometimes makes us see things that simply do not exist? This can happen to not just our eyes, but also to our ears. Not just to our eyes, but also to our minds. Is it hallucinating? I'm not sure. But it sure can feel like that. And in the quiet of an empty space, it's oh so easy to fool our brains. Your own footsteps on the bright, white, polished marble sounds like it's coming from behind you. Your own breathing, be it smooth and steady, or panicked and gasping, feels forced. It's almost like the very natural things become something different. Pure, uninterrupted silence does something to you. It makes you want to fill the blank with things that aren't there. When we lack sensory input, our brains instinctively step in, creating details to make sense of the emptiness. So now you're left in a position where there is nothing to hear and nothing to see. So is it any surprise we get scared? There was a clinic I used to visit whenever I was sick as a child. The doctor was good enough, I suppose. But what stands out to me in my memory is the waiting room. It was this drab, clean, whitewashed space, something that felt almost like it belonged in a dream. It was so empty. Sitting there alone for what felt like endless minutes, sometimes nearly an hour, always felt strange. I was always alone, and with the AC humming steadily, the door closed and the windows shuttered, it felt like I was cut off from the world. The best way I can describe it is that it felt as though the room was somehow separate from everything else, like it existed in its own little bubble, detached from reality. Liminal spaces are spaces that exist in a state of transition, like empty airports, staircases, hallways, or waiting rooms. These places are not quite destinations, but they carry an uneasy energy precisely because they are neither here nor there. And that waiting room was exactly that. A place that wasn't really anywhere, just a pause between being sick at home and seeing the doctor. It wasn't a destination, it wasn't the place the journey began, and it wasn't a part of my everyday world. It was something in between, where time felt distorted, and I felt suspended, just waiting. It was as if the room itself held its breath, existing without purpose until someone walked in to give it meaning again. Not every empty space is a liminal space, and liminality as an idea can stretch beyond just a place. But it's this emptiness that makes liminal spaces, like that waiting room, feel so unsettling sometimes. It's not just that the room was physically empty of people, it was emotionally empty too, devoid of the warmth and purpose that filled other spaces. And in that absence, all that remained was the sense of being between moments, stuck in a place that had lost its meaning. You know those university classes that felt like they dragged on endlessly, stretching each minute into what seemed like an eternity? Why is that? And then there are those vacations that vanish in an instant, slipping away like sand through our fingers. Why is that? When you're having fun and fully engaged in what you're doing, time seems to fly by. Conversely, when you're not enjoying yourself, time crawls to a snail's pace. Now consider what happens when there is nothing to engage at all. Because not only are you disengaged, but you find yourself in a situation where there is literally nothing to engage in. This represents the extreme end of the unsavory spectrum, where time feels unbearably stagnant. So it's strange to think of yourself stuck in an empty school as bored. But apart from simply being bored, you also can feel stuck. Our perception of suspended time can evoke a feeling of being locked in place. So while you know logically that time is moving and you will eventually get out, it feels like you're suspended in a moment that refuses to pass. And in those empty spaces, without the usual buzz of activity, time seems to lose its structure. It becomes harder to gauge how long you have been waiting or how longer you might be there. This distortion can heighten feelings of anxiety and unease, tapping into a primal fear of being trapped in a situation without purpose or direction. It's not just about boredom, it's about the existential dread of being stuck in a moment that feels like it can stretch for forever. So yeah, if you find yourself stuck in an empty mall at 10 in the evening, being bored may just be the better of the devils. Some places are meant to be quiet and empty. Libraries, churches, temples, museums, cemeteries. Places that should ideally never be crowded or noisy. And hence an excessively crowded temple feels strange. A busy library seems out of place. And a noisy cemetery is concerning. There are two elements to this. Firstly is the simple fact that any place that goes against its nature is simply unsettling. The second is the concept of defamiliarization, where something familiar is presented in an unfamiliar way, making us perceive it differently. When a library is filled with chatter, or a museum becomes overly crowded, we are forced to experience these places in a way that contradicts our mental image of them. Essentially, the uncanny effect, when applied to places, is about the dissonance between how a place is and how we perceive it. So an empty airport, an empty school, an empty mall, these feel scary not because there is something inherently supernatural about them, but because they defy our expectations of what these places should be. They are meant to be alive with people, bustling with activity. So when that energy is stripped away, we are left with a void our minds struggle to process. The silence becomes heavy, the emptiness suffocating. It's in this absence of purpose, of people, of familiarity, that unease creeps in. Reminds us that perhaps the scariest thing about emptiness is the story it leaves untold.